I'm just curious, how many of you were influenced to embrace the doctrines of grace through reading C.H. Spurgeon? May I see your hands? Well, why don't you just stand up? Stand up. How many of you were influenced to embrace the doctrines of grace through reading C.H. Spurgeon? That's probably 25% of us who are here. Please be seated. I suspected that it would be so. And if we could trace indirect influences, then I think it would be even greater. For example, in my case, my daddy was a Calvinist when I was born, and so it was primarily through his influence that I grew up embracing the doctrines of grace, but he was tremendously influenced by Spurgeon. I think that Spurgeon is arguably the most influential Baptist in all of history. I hesitate to put him above William Carey and John Bunyan. All three of them are pictured on this portrait right down here. Of course, William Carey's influence has been tremendous through his influence on the modern missions movement. John Bunyan has continued to influence millions of people through Pilgrim's Progress. But I think that Spurgeon is probably more influential than even Carey and Bunyan. Isn't it gratifying to think that among the most influential Baptists who have ever lived, we can call them as brethren, and I think that they would feel very comfortable in our conference. Someone might nominate Billy Graham. Probably no one here would, but someone might nominate Billy Graham as being one of the most influential Baptists of all time. And Graham's influence has been and still is massive. But I seriously doubt, I'm not being cynical, but I seriously doubt that in 100 years people will be reading anything that Billy Graham has written. Greatness needs distance. Close at hand, little things sometimes appear great. The black fly on the window pane looks like the black ox on the distant plain. More than 100 years after Spurgeon's death, however, he has well over 100 books in print. I don't know how much you know about Christian publishing, but if your book gets into a second edition, you're doing great. More than 100 years, he has over 100 books in print, and is probably the most widely published religious author today. I don't know, I haven't read statistics recently, but in the 1980s I did read that in the 1980s Spurgeon was the most published religious author at that time. That's almost 100 years after he died. He died in 1892. And people read Spurgeon. Probably few people who are not Calvinists read Calvin, but people who are not Calvinists read Spurgeon. And to be honest with you, probably few people who are Calvinists read Calvin. But almost all of us read Spurgeon. We have great admiration for Martin Luther, but how many sermons of Martin Luther have you read? Great admiration for Calvin, Edwards, Whitefield. How many of their sermons have you read? But how many sermons of Spurgeon's have you read? Even if you've only read a few, it's probably many more than you've read of Calvin, Luther, Whitefield, Edwards, unless you've had some kind of special academic project that you were doing on one of those guys. Spurgeon is still read today. His works are more in volume than the Encyclopedia Britannica. Though it remains a brash undertaking and a daunting task for one to speak about Spurgeon, if admiration for Spurgeon qualifies one to speak a few words about him, I'm qualified. I admire him greatly. If indebtedness to Spurgeon qualifies one to speak a few words of appreciation for him, I'm qualified because I'm deeply indebted to Spurgeon. In his letter to the Philippians, Paul wrote, "If anyone else thinks he has reasons to put confidence in the flesh, I have more." If I might use the same formula, I say if anyone else thinks he has reason to be appreciative for C.H. Spurgeon, I think I could make a case that I have more. Born of Calvinistic parents, weaned on Spurgeon. I asked my dad the other day, do you, when you're preaching on a text, do you always read Spurgeon on that same text? He said, and my dad's been preaching for well over 40 years, he said, every time I look to see if Spurgeon has published on that text, if he has, I read all that he has published on that text. Now, my dad went on to say, now, you know, I do my own outlines. I know. Nevertheless, I have heard a lot of Spurgeon in my life. And when I first began preaching at age 17, just a mere 5 years ago, that's been about 21 years ago. When I first began preaching, the first set of books my dad gave me was an 8-volume set of Spurgeon sermons, Treasure of the Old Testament, Treasure of the New Testament. And shortly thereafter, I began reading one of Spurgeon's sermons every day as part of my daily devotions. Sometimes I would read sermons aloud to my friends. At that time I was single, and sometimes I would read them to my dates. And many a covert Philistine was discovered when she fidgeted during the reading of a Spurgeon sermon. Once having read a Spurgeon sermon to a friend in college, he commented, "Jim, you preach just like Spurgeon." It's hard to find friends like that, isn't it? His compliment was either sheer ignorance or base flattery, but I still liked it. I was tremendously under the influence of Spurgeon, and when I was in college, battling against ungodly philosophies and liberal theologies, sometimes debating with professors who thought inerrantist was a synonym for stupid idiot, I was steadied and strengthened by my daily time with Spurgeon. It gave me great comfort to know that Spurgeon and I were on the same side and that he had fought some of the same foes I was facing. At one of the colleges I attended, there was a professor who seemed to take an almost diabolic delight in attacking the faith of Bible-believing Christians. He was very popular and his influence was strong on campus. He sneered at historically orthodox theology in general and was especially contemptuous of Calvinism. He and I had a number of lively discussions both in and out of class, which, as I recall, involved his shaking his head quite a bit while wearing a look on his face that said, "I pity you, you stupid Neanderthal Calvinist." On one occasion, when he had maligned the intellectual capacity of those who held to orthodox doctrine, I remember saying to him, "Some of the greatest minds in the history of the world have held to the very doctrines you are attacking. Men like Luther, Calvin, and Spurgeon." And then I added, though it sounds disrespectful from this distance, "Spurgeon had more intellectual ability in his little finger than you have in your whole body." If I were a Corinthian schismatic, I would say, I am of Spurgeon. Spurgeon himself said, "You may take a step from Paul to Augustine." He probably said Augustine, but from Paul to Augustine, and then from Augustine to Calvin, and then, well, you may keep your foot up a good while before you find such another. That's the end of Spurgeon's quote, and now I say, you may put your foot down on C.H. Spurgeon. My talk this morning is divided into 4 sections. The overall theme is Spurgeon and the gospel. But in the pursuit of that theme, I'm going to talk, first of all, about Spurgeon's life, concentrating primarily on the early years. So really only the first part of this is biographical, and I will try to tie it into Spurgeon's embracing Christ and some views of his regarding the gospel in this first biographical section, Spurgeon's life. And then secondly, I'll talk about Spurgeon's gospel. Spurgeon was a Calvinist, and he considered the doctrines of grace essential to a true understanding of the biblical gospel. And then thirdly, I want to talk a while about Spurgeon's characteristics. Finally, say a word about Spurgeon's works and works about Spurgeon. Spurgeon was born June 19th, 1834, and he was an Englishman. I'm sure that most of you know that, but it's possible that there are some here who are not acquainted with Spurgeon at all. He was an Englishman. He was the first of 17 children born to Eliza and John Spurgeon. Now, 9 of those children died in infancy. Those were brutal days, weren't they? I have 4 little girls. I'm expecting a 5th little girl. I've told some people I'm thinking about changing my name to Zelophehad, renaming the girls Noah, Milcah, Hogla, Zilpah, and Tirzah. When I say that, then the girls always point at one another and say, "You're going to be Hogla!" But Spurgeon's mother was only 19 when he was born. And I always like to think about, well, how old were the parents when this happened to Spurgeon? Spurgeon was 19 when he burst upon the scene in London, England, and within a few months was the most well-known preacher in the world. And his mother was just my age. His mother was 38. She was the parent. She was still having babies, I suppose. She had 16 to go after C.H. Spurgeon. And his father, John Spurgeon, was a congregational minister. None of the biographies or the autobiographies really say why, but when he was about 18 months old, Spurgeon went to live with his grandfather. And Spurgeon's grandfather, James Spurgeon, apparently was the great paternal influence in his life, the great masculine influence. Even after living there for 6 years, when he went home to live with his own biological parents at age 7.5, there's still not much talk about his dad. His dad was a bivocational minister, and he was often gone during the week, preaching in the evenings, and then he had his pastoral responsibilities on the weekend. So I get the impression that his father was really not around all that much. And we're probably... We're far more harsh on what I have just said than they would have been in Spurgeon's day. Those were different times. James Dobson had not yet arisen, and people like David Livingston would go off and leave their families for 2 or 3 years, and sailors, people working on whale ships, they would be gone for years. It was not viewed as shockingly. I'm not saying that it was good. I'm just saying that it was not such a shock to them as it is to us to think about his dad being gone all the time. But Spurgeon's really formative years were in the home of his grandfather, James Spurgeon, who was also a congregational preacher. They enjoyed a great relationship all of their lives. After Spurgeon became famous, he was late to a preaching appointment one time, something that Spurgeon rarely did. He was rarely late, but he was late this time. He had been stopped somehow or another. And his grandfather was there, and so his grandfather began preaching on the text, "For by grace are ye saved." And after he had gotten through the first head of the sermon, the fountain of salvation, by grace, in came his grandson. He said, "Well, my famous grandson has come now, and so I will defer to him. Now, son, I've already gotten through the first head of the sermon, which is for by grace are you saved, the fountain of grace." And so then Spurgeon came up, and he took the sermon up from there and preached the second point. And he was just getting to the place, not of works, lest any man should boast, when his grandfather tugged on his coattail and said, "I know more about that than you do." And so Spurgeon sat down, and his grandfather sat up and preached for a little while, and then he turned it back over to his grandson. So they had a great relationship all of their lives. It was while he was in his grandfather's house that he discovered books. I remember he was just 7.5 when he left his grandfather's house. Think of how you and I have to struggle through the reading of the Puritans. Little 7.5-year-old Spurgeon discovered the Puritans. I mean, before he was 7.5, and he's up there in the attic reading the Puritans. Especially, he finds Pilgrim's Progress, loves Pilgrim's Progress. He reads it more than, in the course of his life, he read it more than 100 times. His grandmother told him that she would give him, I think it was a penny for every hymn of Isaac Watts that he would memorize. And he just about bankrupted her. And so she reduced the price to half a penny. And then his grandfather told him that he would give him a shilling for every dozen rats that he killed, and so he gave up hymn memorizing for rat catching. But he said later on that the hymn memorizing was much better. He was constantly quoting Isaac Watts and other hymn writers in his sermons. And let me, before I forget, take this opportunity to say that Spurgeon and great preachers like him were great admirers of poetry. And let me just put in a word for poetry. That poetry is condensed philosophy. It is very intense and condensed thinking. And Spurgeon loved George Herbert, would read other great poets, and also the Puritans did too. You see that they were constantly making verse on things, and some of it's very fine verse. I urge you to rediscover poetry. And Spurgeon was a great admirer of poetry, and he would be constantly quoting, usually hymns, but sometimes poetry of a higher literary order. He was certainly acquainted with it. He went back home at age 7.5 to live with his own parents. By that time, there were some other children in the home. He quickly became their hero. In school, he was the top scholar in the school, but at one period he suddenly went from the head of the class to last in the class, and the teacher couldn't understand why this had happened until she recognized that in the seating arrangement that she had, the person who was the brightest scholar occupied a place that was near to a drafty door, while the person who was the poorest scholar occupied a seat near to the furnace. Not the furnace, what's the word I'm looking for? The stove. Occupied the place nearest to the stove. And Spurgeon, in order to get away from the cold, drafty door, went down in his study so he could sit close to the stove. And so when she rearranged the seating arrangement, then Spurgeon once again quickly assumed his place as the top scholar in the school. At age 14, he left home to go to school himself and do some school teaching as well. When he was about 10 years old, so we're going back 4 years, when he was about 10 years old, he came under conviction for his sin and began thinking very seriously about eternal matters. I must confess, he says, that I never would have been saved if I could have helped it. As long as ever I could, I rebelled and revolted and struggled against God. When he would have me pray, I would not pray. And when he would have me listen to the sound of the ministry, I would not. And when I heard and the tear rolled down my cheek, I wiped it away and defied him to melt my soul. But long before I began with Christ, he began with me. His mother was a great influence on him during these years of his searching. One time, Spurgeon's father was going off to preach somewhere and was smitten with conviction that he was spending too much time away from home. He turned his horses around and he went back home. When he arrived home, no one was in the bottom story of the house, and so he went up the stairs and he could hear his wife's voice. She had all of the children gathered in her room and she was pleading for them. praying that their souls would be saved. Mrs. Spurgeon would spend one evening each week talking to one of her children. And it's left in her writings that on Monday she would speak to Charles, on Tuesday she would speak to, and then she would name the other children, talking to them about their souls. One evening after she had prayed for them, she said very solemnly to them all, "My children, if you do not embrace Christ, on the day of judgment, your mother will be a swift witness against you." And Spurgeon said that really entered into his soul. Later on, his mother said, "It was a mercy that Charles was converted young." He was a man of tremendous powers, and you can just imagine what a strong-willed child he was. It was a mercy that he was converted young. Spurgeon once said, "When I'm gone, all sorts of people will write my life. They will have some difficulty in accounting for the position God has given me. I can tell you 2 reasons why I am what I am." He paused. "My mother and the truth of my message." During these days of his conviction, he read Joseph Alleen's Alarm to the Unconverted. He read Richard Baxter's Call to the Unconverted. He read Doddridge's Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul, and several others. He says it was like sitting at the foot of Sinai. In one of his sermons, I believe this is in Volume 9 of the Metropolitan Tabernacle Pulpit, he preaches a sermon on the warrant of faith. So it's an excellent sermon. He apparently during this year was combating hyper-Calvinism, and there are several sermons in the 9th volume that deal with offering the gospel to unconverted persons. And the warrant of faith is a very powerful sermon in that volume. He says regarding Alleen Baxter, "Some preachers in the Puritanic times, whose shoe latchets I am not worthy to unloose, erred much in this matter of the free offer of the gospel. I refer not merely to Alleen and Baxter, who are far better preachers of the law than of the gospel, but I include men far sounder in the faith than they, such as Rogers of Dedham, Shepherd, the author of The Sound Believer, and especially the American Thomas Hooker, who has written a book upon qualifications for coming to Christ. These excellent men had a fear of preaching the gospel to any except whom they styled sensible sinners, and consequently kept hundreds of their hearers sitting in darkness when they might have rejoiced in the light. They preached repentance and hatred of sin as the warrant of a sinner's trusting in Christ. According to them, a sinner might reason thus: I possess such and such a degree of sensibility on account of sin, therefore I have a right to trust in Christ. Now, I venture to affirm that such reasoning is seasoned with fatal error. Whoever preaches in this fashion may preach much of the gospel, but the whole gospel of the free grace of God in its fullness he has yet to learn." At the same time, later on, although he criticized these men for a less than free preaching of the gospel, he says in his autobiography, "Personally, I have to bless God for many good books. I thank him for Dr. Doddridge's Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul, for Baxter's Call to the Unconverted, for Alleen's Alarm to Sinners, and for James' Anxious Inquirer. But my gratitude most of all is due to God, not for books, but for the preached word. And that, too, addressed to me by a poor, uneducated man, a man who had never received any training for the ministry and probably will never be heard of in this life, a man engaged in business, no doubt of a humble kind, during the week, but who had just enough of grace to say on the Sabbath, 'Look unto me and be ye saved, all ye ends of the earth.' The books were good, but the man was better. The revealed word awakened me, but it was the preached word that saved me. And I must ever attach peculiar value to the hearing of the truth, for by it I received the joy and peace in which my soul delights. And that reminds me of Peter preaching on the day of Pentecost. They knew everything that Peter had said to them about the facts, but it says, when they heard these things, then they were pricked to the heart. They were cut to the heart when they heard them. So Spurgeon believed very strongly in the preaching of the gospel. He published many books and so on, but still his emphasis was on the preaching of the Word of God. He describes his inner strivings like this, and well, let me read it and then make a comment on it. But as yet, a deeper apprehension, that's okay. When I was in the hands of the Holy Spirit under conviction of sin, I had a clear and sharp sense of the justice of God. Sin, whatever it might be to other people, became to me an intolerable burden. It was not so much that I feared hell as that I feared sin. And all the while I had upon my mind a deep concern for the honor of God's name and the integrity of his moral government. I felt that it would not satisfy my conscience if I could be forgiven unjustly. And of course that sort of thing affected his preaching. That when we preach the gospel clearly, it should lead the unconverted to think thoughts like that. There must be a propitiation for sin so that God, who is perfectly just, can remain just and yet be the justifier of the ungodly. And that was a great concern to Spurgeon. After about 5 years of this, well, let me mention that at age 15, just before he was converted, he wrote a little essay that he entered in a contest, 295 pages, on Antichrist and her brood, or Popery Unmasked. There's a chapter of that is included in the 4-volume autobiography. It's kind of impressive. He was converted finally on January 6th, 1850. He was age 15. Wouldn't be 16 until June. Now I'm going to read to you his own account of his conversion, and it will be familiar to some, but I'm sure it will be a blessing to you again, and especially if you've never heard it before. While under concern of soul, I resolved that I would attend all the places of worship in the town where I lived in order that I might find out the way of salvation. So he makes up his mind. He's going to go everywhere. I was willing to do anything, to be anything, if God would only forgive my sin. I set off determined to go round to all the chapels, and I did go to every place of worship, but for a long time I went in vain. I do not, however, blame the ministers. One man preached divine sovereignty. I could hear him with pleasure, but what was that sublime truth to a poor sinner who wished to know what he must do to be saved? There was another admirable man who always preached about the law, but what was the use of plowing up ground that needed to be sown? Incidentally, all the while Spurgeon is telling us about what he thinks about the gospel. Another was a practical preacher. I heard him, but it was very much like a commanding officer teaching the maneuvers of war to a set of men without feet. What could I do? What could I do? All his exhortations were lost on me. I knew it was said, "Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved," but I did not know what it was to believe on Christ. These good men all preached truths suited to many in their congregations who were spiritually minded people, but what I wanted to know was, how can I get my sins forgiven? And they never told me that. I desired to hear how a poor sinner under a sense of sin might find peace with God. And when I went, I heard a sermon on "Be not deceived. God is not mocked, which cut me up still worse, but did not bring me into rest. I went again another day, and the text was something about the glories of the righteous. Nothing for poor me. I was like a dog under the table, not allowed to eat of the children's food. I went time after time, and I can honestly say that I do not know that I ever went without prayer to God, and I am sure there was not a more attentive hearer than myself in all the place, for I panted and longed to understand how I might be saved. I sometimes think I might have been in darkness and despair until now had it not been for the goodness of God in sending a snowstorm one Sunday morning while I was going to a certain place of worship. When I could go no further, I turned down a side street and came to a little primitive Methodist chapel. In that chapel, there may have been a dozen or 15 people. I had heard of the primitive Methodists, how they sang so loudly that they made people's heads ache, but that did not matter to me. I wanted to know how I might be saved, and if they could tell me that, I did not care how much they made my head ache. The minister did not come that morning. He was snowed up, I suppose. At last, a very thin-looking man, a shoemaker or tailor or something of that sort, went up into the pulpit to preach. Now, it is well that preachers should be instructed, but this man was really stupid. He was obliged to stick to his text for the simple reason that he had little else to say. The text was, "Look unto me, and be ye saved, all the ends of the earth." He did not even pronounce the words rightly, but that did not matter. There was, I thought, a glimpse of hope for me in that text. The preacher began thus: "My dear friends, this is a very simple text indeed. It says, look. Now look and don't take a deal of pains. It ain't lifting your foot or your finger, it just says look. Well, a man needn't go to college to learn to look. You may be the biggest fool, and yet you can look. A man needn't be worth 1,000 a year to be able to look. Anyone can look, even a child can look." But then the text says, "Look unto me." "Aye," he said in his broad Essex, "many on ye are looking to yourselves, but it's no use looking there. You'll never find any comfort in yourselves. Some look to God the Father. No, look to him by and by. Jesus Christ says, look unto me. Some on ye say, we must wait for the Spirit's working. You have no business with that just now. Look to Christ. The text says, look unto me." Then the good man followed up his text in this way: "Look unto me. I'm sweating great drops of blood. Look unto me. I'm hanging on the cross. Look unto me. I am dead and buried. Look unto me. I rise again. Look unto me. I ascend to heaven. Look unto me. I am sitting at the Father's right hand. Oh, poor sinner, look unto me. Look unto me." When he had gone to about that length and managed to spin out 10 minutes or so, he was at the end of his tether. Then he looked at me under the gallery, and I dare say with so few present he knew me to be a stranger. Just fixing his eyes on me, as if he knew all my heart, he said, "Young man, you look very miserable." Well, I did. But I had not been accustomed to have remarks made from the pulpit on my personal appearance before. However, it was a good blow, struck right home. He continued, "And you will always be miserable, miserable in life and miserable in death if you don't obey my text. But if you obey now, this moment, you will be saved." Then lifting up his hands, he shouted, as only a primitive Methodist could do, "Young man, look to Jesus Christ! Look! 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 You have nothing to do but to look and live!" I saw at once the way of salvation. I know not what else he said. I did not take much notice of it. I was so possessed with that one thought. Like as when the brazen serpent was lifted up, the people only looked and were healed, so it was with me. I had been waiting to do 50 things, but when I heard that word, look, What a charming word it seemed to me. Oh, I looked until I could almost have looked my eyes away. There and then the cloud was gone. The darkness had rolled away. And that moment I saw the sun. I could have risen that instant and sung with the most enthusiastic of them of the precious blood of Christ and the simple faith which looks alone to Him. Oh, that somebody had told me this before. Trust Christ and you shall be saved. Yet it was, no doubt, all wisely ordered. And now I can say, ere since by faith I saw the stream thy flowing wounds supply, redeeming love has been my theme and shall be till I die. And that verse of Cooper's appears on Spurgeon's tomb. When Spurgeon first went to London, I'll tell you in a few minutes, he carried a blue spotted handkerchief. They laughed at him for it. I couldn't find one, so I just brought an old napkin. I'm sorry about that. My wife tells me not to do that in the pulpit, but it's better than the alternative. After he was converted, like I said, his father and his grandfather were Congregationalists, Paedo-Baptists. But Spurgeon was convinced that only believers should be baptized. And so, he was only 15. He wrote to his parents asking them for their permission that he might be baptized. They wrote him back, giving him permission, his father including an admonition not to trust in your baptism for salvation. And his mother added a note that said, Charles, I have always prayed that you would become a Christian, but I never prayed that you would become a Baptist. And Spurgeon wrote back to his mother and said, isn't it just like the Lord in His bounty to grant you exceedingly and abundantly above anything that you ask? He walked 8 miles to be baptized. It wasn't long after that, at age 16, that his preaching career began. At first, he spoke only to the Sunday school gathering, and at that time it was mostly for children. But when the adults knew that Spurgeon was going to be speaking at the Sabbath school, then they came to hear Spurgeon too. He went to Cambridge, not to the university, but to teach school there and to further his own education with a tutor. And it was while he was in Cambridge that he preached his first sermon at age 16. An older brother who was coordinating mission work for the area said to Spurgeon, would you go to such and such a place tomorrow evening with a young man? There's a young man who's going to be conducting service there, and he's not accustomed to preaching, and he would be glad of company. And so Spurgeon met a young man on the road, and as they went along, Spurgeon said to the young man, I'll be praying for you as you preach the Word of God tonight. And the young man said, I could never do such a thing in all my life. The brother told me it was you who were going to be doing the preaching. And so Spurgeon started thinking, well, surely I can tell out a few words to a few poor cottagers. He afterward reflected on what the older missionary had said. There is a young man who's going to be conducting services who's not much used to preaching, and he would be glad of company. And Spurgeon didn't know that it was he. Not long after that, at age 17, he was called to pastor a small church that did not remain small long, and in a place called Water Beach. It built up tremendously. He was an indefatigable worker, tireless visitor, would walk preaching all over the place during these days. It was thought that he should go to college. His father wanted him to go to college, and he was willing to submit to his father's authority, go to college. It was arranged that he should meet with Dr. Angus, who was the head of Stepney College, and he was shown into a room at the place where they were appointed to meet. He waited there for 2 or 3 hours for Dr. Angus, and Dr. Angus never came, and so he left, found out later that Dr. Angus had been shown into a different room in the same house, and that they had waited in different rooms with a wall between them until finally Dr. Angus had to leave. But Spurgeon thought that was of the Lord, and after he left that thwarted attempt to go to college, the words from Jeremiah came to him, "Seekest thou great things for thyself? Seek them not." And Spurgeon felt like that was the Lord saying, don't seek further education in the attempt to make yourself a great man. Of course, Spurgeon never disparaged education. He, as we'll see later on, he started a pastor's college. But it was when he was 19 years old. He came to his little chapel one day, Water Beach Chapel, and there was a letter from the pulpit committee or the deacons at the New Park Street Baptist Church in London. New Park Street was perhaps the most influential Baptist church historically in England. Had been pastored by Benjamin Keach. I think Kriegel Books still has some of his books in print. John Gill and also John Rippon had been pastor at New Park Street. And Spurgeon thought, well, there must be some misunderstanding. Surely this great church would not send an invitation to me. He wrote back to them saying, there must be some mistake. I'm only 19 years old. And they wrote back and said, there's no mistake. We want you to fill the pulpit at your earliest convenience. And so in December of 1853, Spurgeon was just 19 years old, he went to the New Park Street. He was very intimidated by the whole situation. He was nervous about it. And let me say that Spurgeon was often nervous about preaching. He said Luther trembled when he went into the pulpit. And Spurgeon himself would say before he went into the pulpit, God have mercy on me, a sinner. Well, Spurgeon, when he preached at New Park Street, the place just exploded. And how did it happen? This is Spurgeon speaking now. Someone asked me how I got my congregation. I never got it at all. I did not think it was my duty to do so. I only had to preach the gospel. Why, my congregation got my congregation. I had 80 or scarcely 100 when I preached first. The next time, 200. Incidentally, that was from morning to evening. Had about 80 in the morning, 200 that night. Everyone who heard me was saying to his neighbor, you must go and hear this young man. Next meeting, we had 400. And in 6 weeks, 800. That was the way in which my people got my congregation. Now the people are admitted by tickets. That does very well. A member can give his ticket to another person and say, I will stand in the aisle or I will get in with the crowd. Some persons will not go if they can get in easily. But they will go if you tell them they cannot get in without a ticket. That is the way congregations ought to bring a congregation about a minister. A minister preaches all the better if he has a large congregation. He exploded on the scene. He was like, well, I started to say he was like Michael Jackson, but that would be so profane. But that's the kind of popularity. If some real popular rock star or movie star would show up at a junior high school, that's almost the way it was with Spurgeon. He writes to his wife before they were married, my congregation was enormous, I think 10,000. But certainly twice as many as at Exeter Hall. The Lord was with me, and the profoundest silence was observed, but oh, the close! Never did mortal man receive a more enthusiastic oration. I wonder I am alive. After the service, 5 or 6 gentlemen endeavored to clear a passage, but I was borne along amid cheers and prayers and shouts for about a quarter of an hour. It really seemed more like a week. I was hurried round and round the field without hope of escape until suddenly, seeing a nice open carriage with 2 occupants standing near, I sprang in and begged them to drive away. This they most kindly did, and I stood up, waving my hat and crying, "The blessing of God be with you!" while from thousands of heads the hats were lifted and cheer after cheer was given. Surely amid these plaudits I can hear the low rumbling of an advancing storm of reproaches. But even this I can bear for the Master's sake. My, that was a prophetic sentence. There were many, many reproaches that were rumbling in the not-too-distant future. There were many that admired him and loved him, obviously, but there were many who also hated him and criticized him brutally. New Park Street became jammed, stifling, was hot, they couldn't breathe. Spurgeon begged with the deacons to open some of the windows. I gather that it was a situation like this. Open some of those windows, but they couldn't be opened, and so one day they came to church and the windows were broken out. And Spurgeon said that the culprit should be tracked down and given a reward of £5. The closest he ever came to admitting that it was he who broke out the windows was once pointing to a stout stick that might have done it. Well, the church had to be enlarged, and so they rented Exeter Hall, which seated 6,000. People thought that was bold, but Exeter Hall would not hold his hearers. And then in 1856, October of 1856, Spurgeon is 22 years old. He rents the Surrey Gardens Music Hall. It would seat 10,000. The paper said, "Oh, now he is really arrogant, getting a place with 10,000. But on the day that he was scheduled to preach there that night, people began arriving in the early afternoon. By the time it was time for church to start, there were 10,000 people inside and 10,000 people outside who couldn't get in. It was a great shock to Spurgeon to see this tremendous crowd, but he made his way in. Just after the service had begun, some miscreants, apparently mischief makers, shouted out, "Fire! Fire! The galleries are giving way!" And a panic ensued, and 7 persons were crushed to death in the panic that followed. 28 persons were seriously injured. It nearly killed Spurgeon. Not the crush, but the shock to his nervous system. For a couple of weeks he was unable to preach. He had to take a retreat to the country to get away from crowds. And some say that he never got over it, that his dying at age 57, such a young age, was partly to be attributed to the shock that his system received on that tragic occasion at the Surrey Music Hall. But after God healed him sufficiently and brought him back, he again preached in the Surrey Music Hall regularly. Not long after that, he preached to a crowd of 23,000 in the Crystal Palace. Spurgeon said, "If crowds come to hear a preacher, some are ready to say, 'Oh, they are running after a man.' What would you have them run after? A woman?" Spurgeon was a tourist attraction. People who went to London wanted to see Madame Tussauds, the wax museum, and they wanted to go hear Spurgeon. Later on, he built the great Metropolitan Tabernacle. Some people say it would seat 3,800. Some people say it would hold 6,000. Usually, people will say around 5,000. Week after week, until 1892, he, for about 35 years, he preached to the thousands upon thousands in London. Someone asked an American boy, "Who is the Prime Minister of England?" He said, "Spurgeon." Now let's think a bit about Spurgeon's gospel. Spurgeon says, "I can remember the manner in which I learned the doctrines of grace." This is how he came to embrace the doctrines of grace. "I learned the doctrines of grace in a single instant. Born, as all of us are by nature, an Arminian, I still believed the old things I had heard continually from the pulpit and did not see the grace of God. When I was coming to Christ, I thought I was doing it all myself. And though I sought the Lord earnestly, I had no idea the Lord was seeking me. I do not think the young convert is at first aware of this. I can recall the very day and hour when I first received those truths into my own soul. And we can tell by his diaries that it was when he was 15, about 3 months after he was converted. When they were, as John Bunyan says, burnt into my heart as with a hot iron. And I can recollect how I felt that I had grown on a sudden from a babe into a man, and that I had made progress in scriptural knowledge through having found once for all the clue to the truth of God. One weeknight when I was sitting in the house of God, I was not thinking much about the preacher's sermon, for I did not believe it. The thought struck me, how did you come to be a Christian? I sought the Lord. But how did you come to seek the Lord? The truth flashed across my mind in a moment. I should not have sought him unless there had been some previous influence in my mind to make me seek him. To make me seek him. I prayed, thought I. I prayed, thought I. But then I asked myself, how came I to pray? I was induced to pray by reading the Scriptures. How came I to read the Scriptures? I did read them, but what led me to do so? Then, in a moment, I saw that God was at the bottom of all of it, and that he was the author of my faith. And so the whole doctrine of grace opened up to me, and from that doctrine, I have not departed to this day. And I desire to make this my constant confession. I ascribe my change wholly to God. Now, for Spurgeon, Calvinism was far more than the 5 points of Calvinism. He says, first let me ask, must we not all of us submit to an overruling providence and the appointment of Jehovah's mind as to the means whereby we came into this world? Those men who think that afterwards we are left to our own free will to choose this one or the other to direct our steps must admit that our entrance into the world was not of our own will, but that God had then to choose for us. What circumstances were those in our power which led us to elect certain persons to be our parents? Had we anything to do with it? Did not God himself appoint our parents, native place, and friends? So for him, God's sovereignty was something that governed all of life. It wasn't just a soteriological idea, but it was something that affected all of life. What did Spurgeon have to say about election? A lot. Let me just read 15 or 20 lines to you. I believe the doctrine of election because I am quite certain that if God had not chosen me, I should never have chosen him. And I'm sure he chose me before I was born, or else he never would have chosen me afterwards. And he must have elected me for reasons unknown to me, for I could never find any reason in myself why he should have looked upon me with special love. As he continues, I want you to see that this is also an instance of Spurgeon's almost omnipresent playful wit. He was a great wit. But he continues, so I am forced to accept that great biblical doctrine. I recollect an Arminian brother telling me that he had read the Scriptures through a score or more times and could never find the doctrine of election in them. He added that he was sure he would have done so if it had been there, for he read the Word on his knees. I said to him, I think you read the Bible in a very uncomfortable posture. And if you had read it in your easy chair, you would have been more likely to understand it. Pray, he continues talking to the Arminian. Pray, by all means, and the more the better. But it is a piece of superstition to think that there is anything in the posture in which a man puts himself for reading. And as to reading through the Bible 20 times without having found anything about the doctrine of election, the wonder is that you found anything at all. You must have galloped through it at such a rate that you were not likely to have any intelligible idea of the meaning of the Scriptures. Then he has this to say about election, and this is also an example of his eloquence. In the very beginning, when this great universe lay in the mind of God, like unborn forests in the acorn cup. Now that's the sort of thing, if you just read Spurgeon too fast, you'll not appreciate that. Like unborn forests in the acorn cup. In the very beginning, when this great universe lay in the mind of God like unborn forests in the acorn cup, long ere the echoes awoke the solitudes, before the mountains were brought forth, and long ere the light flashed through the sky, God loved his chosen creatures. Before there was any created being, when the ether was not fanned by an angel's wing, when space itself had not an existence, when there was nothing save God alone, even then, in that loneliness of deity and in that deep quiet and profundity, his bowels moved with love for his chosen. Their names were written on his heart, and then were they dear to his soul. Jesus loved his people before the foundation of the world, even from eternity. And when he called me by his grace, he said to me, I have loved thee with an everlasting love. Therefore with loving kindness have I drawn thee. Let me say just a word that Spurgeon sets an example for us. We're in a day when eloquence and beautiful language is looked at skeptically. And we've got to take that into account. But be bold if God has given you the gift to use it. Try to affect your hearers and yourself with the use of language. God's truth is beautiful. And don't try to force it if you don't have the gift. But if you do have the gift, like Spurgeon did, then don't be afraid to use it. Well, my time is fleeing away. I have so much more here. Spurgeon on freeness of grace, unconditional. Let me pass over some things, but I do want to read you this on the gospel, since the theme of our conference is the gospel. If anyone should ask me, Spurgeon speaking, if anyone should ask me what I mean by a Calvinist, I should reply, he is one who says salvation is of the Lord. I cannot find in Scripture any other doctrine than this. It is the essence of the Bible. He only is my rock and my salvation. Tell me anything contrary to this truth, and it will be heresy. Tell me a heresy, and I shall find its essence here, that it has departed from this great, this fundamental, this rock truth. God is my rock and my salvation. What is the heresy of Rome but the addition of something to the perfect merits of Jesus Christ, the bringing in of the works of the flesh to assist in our justification? And what is the heresy of Arminianism but the addition of something to the work of the Redeemer? Every heresy, if brought to the touchstone, will discover itself here. I have my own private opinion that there is no such thing as preaching Christ and Him crucified unless we preach what is nowadays called Calvinism. It is a nickname to call it Calvinism. Calvinism is the doctrine and nothing else. No. Calvinism is the gospel and nothing else. I do not believe we can preach the gospel if we do not preach justification by faith without works, nor unless we preach the sovereignty of God in His dispensation of grace, nor unless we exalt the electing, unchangeable, eternal, immutable, conquering love of Jehovah. Nor do I think we can preach the gospel unless we base it upon the special and particular redemption of His elect and chosen people, which Christ wrought out upon the cross. Nor can I comprehend a gospel which lets saints fall away after they are called, and suffers the children of God to be burned in the fires of damnation after having once believed in Jesus. Such a gospel I abhor. If ever it should come to pass that sheep of Christ might fall away, my fickle, feeble soul, alas, would fall 1,000 times a day. If one dear saint of God had perished, so might all. If one of the covenant ones be lost, so might all. And then there is no gospel promise true, but the Bible is a lie. And there is nothing in it worth my acceptance. I will be an infidel at once when I can believe that a saint of God can ever fall finally. If God hath loved me once, then he will love me forever. God has a mastermind. He arranged everything in his gigantic intellect long before he did it. And once having settled it, he never alters it. Of course, he was a great adherent to particular redemption. He said, we are sometimes criticized for limiting the atonement of Christ, but it is actually you, my Arminian brother, who limit the atonement of Christ. You limit the atonement of Christ to those who might be willing. Instead, we have a particular, definite redemption that Christ will get who he paid for. Although he was a Calvinist, he was not mad about it. And after what I just read about his saying the gospel is Calvinism, Calvinism is the gospel, and this other stuff is not the gospel, you might think that he was a person other than the person that he was, which is glimpsed in this. There is no soul living who holds more firmly to the doctrines of grace than I do. And if any man asks me whether I am ashamed to be called a Calvinist, I answer, I wish to be called nothing but a Christian. But if you ask me, do I hold the doctrinal views which were held by John Calvin, I reply, I do in the main hold them and rejoice to avow it. But far be it from me even to imagine that Zion contains nothing but Calvinistic Christians within her walls, or that there are none saved who do not hold our views. Most atrocious things have been spoken about the character and spiritual condition of John Wesley, the modern Prince of Arminians. I can only say concerning him that while I detest many of the doctrines which he preached, yet for the man himself, I have a reverence second to no Wesleyan. And if there were wanted 2 apostles to be added to the number of the 12, I do not believe that there could be found 2 men more fit to be so added than George Whitefield and John Wesley. The character of John Wesley stands beyond all imputation for self-sacrifice, zeal, holiness, and communion with God. He lived far above the ordinary level of common Christians and was one of whom the world was not worthy. I believe there are multitudes of men who cannot see these truths, or at least cannot see them in the way in which we put them, who nevertheless have received Christ as their Savior and are as dear to the heart of God of grace as the soundest Calvinist in or out of heaven. I don't have the quotation with me, but he was, of course, not at all wishy-washy. He didn't say it doesn't matter what you believe. The quote is something like, the devil says, be an anythingarian. But then he goes on to say that the devil can take Calvinists to hell just as well as Arminians. So that's a brief glimpse of Spurgeon and his gospel. And so, since the time is gone, I'm just going to have to really summarize the last 2 points. Spurgeon's characteristics. He was, first of all, a preacher. He was a wonderful orator, but he was also a gigantic intellect. Spurgeon was a speed reader. He could read a lot. When I first came to be Mr. Spurgeon's near neighbor, I found that his knowledge of all literature was wonderful. His power of reading was perhaps never equaled. He would sit down to 5 or 6 large books and master them at one sitting. He sat with his left hand flat on the page at the left side of the book and pushing his right hand up the page on the right side until the page projected a little, and he turned it over with his finger and proceeded to the next page. He took in the contents almost at a glance, reading by sentences as others read by words, and his memory never failed him as to what he had read. He made a point of reading half a dozen of the hardest books every week, as he wished to rub his mind up against the strongest minds, and there was no skipping. I several times had an opportunity of testing the thoroughness of his reading, and I never found him at fault. And the writer, Dr. William Wright, goes on to talk about an occasion when Spurgeon had just received a new book off the press, and Dr. Wright had also read the book. And someone said, well, Spurgeon, you could not possibly have read that book yet. And Spurgeon went on to quote several pages. Dr. Wright went back to his room and checked the pages that he had quoted, and he said it was almost verbatim. So he was a gigantic intellect. He was a tireless worker. Alexander Balfour asked him, Mr. Spurgeon, I want to know how you get through the work you do. Tell me how you manage it. Mr. Spurgeon, looking up with a smile, said, I suppose you think that a man who works 12 hours a day can get through a good deal of work? Yes, said Mr. Balfour. Well, said Spurgeon, I work 18. It's hard to believe. It strains credulity to read all that he did. I've already mentioned that Spurgeon was a great humorist. In the autobiography, at least in the 4-volume autobiography, there is one, maybe 2 chapters entitled Pure Fun. And once you catch on to Spurgeon's wit, he's not telling jokes in his sermons, but you'll find in his sermons that there's some stuff that will sometimes at least make you draw a smiley face in the margin, if not laugh out loud. Sometimes he would be tremendously depressed. He would cry for hours and not know why. He said, there are dungeons beneath the castle of despair. He was sick most of his life. He had the gout, he had Bright's disease, he had rheumatoid arthritis. The gout was terribly painful. He quotes Lucian, an ancient writer, who said that fire was coursing through my veins. I thought that I had been bitten by a cobra, but it was worse. It was the gout. Spurgeon says, if you put your foot in a vice and tighten it as tight as you possibly can, that's rheumatism. If you tighten it one more turn, that's gout. For about the last 22 years of his ministry, he missed about 1/3 of the Sunday mornings at his church because of sickness. Just a word finally about Spurgeon's works. His literary works are astounding. His sermons began issued in 1855 and continued at a rate of 1 per week until 1916. He died in 92, but they had enough backlog of sermons that were taken down by stenographers. Until 1916, not because they'd run out of sermons, but because the First World War had caused a paper shortage. The collected set comprises 63 volumes. Depending on how you count his other books, you can come up with a figure as high as 200 books to his credit. Among the many books, his most valuable, in my opinion, are The Treasury of David, his lifelong literary work. It took him 20 years as a commentary on the Psalms. It can be obtained fairly affordably, new. You young preachers, be sure to get a copy. It will be a dear friend to you if you use it. His lectures to my students, again, it's good for young and old, fabulous. A man's great reputation could have been established on just one of these books. Commenting and Commentaries contains about 4,000 book reviews. John Plowman's Talks and Pictures, Morning and Evening. Our own hymn book, it's available from Pilgrim's Press. If you want to have a great, concise collection of religious poetry, it's a wonderful resource. Just costs you $3 or $4 probably. Our own hymn book, a commentary on Matthew. He was the editor of The Sword and Trowel. Those volumes are also available from Pilgrim Publications. Institutions, on his 50th birthday, they cited a list of 66 organizations which Spurgeon had begun and superintended, including the Pastors' College, orphanages, a coal porters association. And finally, it leaves me just to say a few words about works on Spurgeon. If you've read Dallamore's Whitefield, then you know that D.M. Lloyd Jones says something on the back like, Whitefield has never been given justice. Now he finally has been given justice by Dallamore. My own opinion is that what Dallamore did for Whitefield remains to be done by Spurgeon, and it will be a lifelong work for the man who does it. But among the works that are available, you've got the 4-volume autobiography. If you are a real Spurgeon fan and want a lot of stuff, read the 4-volume autobiography. If you just would like to have a pretty good look at him, then get the 2-volume edition by Ian Murray that's done by Banner of Truth. As for biographies, Dallamore is in the bookstore here, and Dallamore is pretty good. He gives a pretty good interview. But if you want a little more zip to your biography, then read one of the 2 biographies written by men who knew Spurgeon personally. One of them is printed by Moody Press. Author is W.Y. Fullerton, and you can get it from Cumberland Valley for about $3.50. It's my favorite biography of Spurgeon. The other biography written by a friend of Spurgeon's was the one written by J.C. Carlyle. A really dumbed-down edition of it is being published by Barber and is available. I wish they hadn't trimmed it down the way they did, but it's still pretty good. And there are some things in there. You get some little nuances, comments that they make about Spurgeon that only someone who knew him could make. And I think it's very valuable. Of course, there's a lot of apocryphal information about Spurgeon, things that are just not true, and sometimes reading the autobiography or something written by the men who actually knew Spurgeon will clear up some of that stuff. I praise God for Charles Haddon Spurgeon. And